Welcome to the Let's Talk Universal podcast, where we ask top experts and consultants about DEI, leadership, and culture. And today I'm joined by Minette Norman, author, speaker, and leadership consultant. Welcome, Minette.
Thank you for having me, Erica. I'm very happy to be here.
Oh, I'm pleased to have you. It's been such a long time since we first spoke, and we've managed to get you on the podcast, and it's been such a long time in the making, but I'm very excited. Before we kind of get into kind of leadership, inclusive leadership specifically, could you let us know how it is that you got into this line of work? Was there a particular moment or circumstance that kind of led you into this work?
There was. So before I became an author and speaker and leadership consultant, I spent 30 years in Silicon Valley in the software industry. And I kind of thought I would just do that forever. I didn't really have plans to become a consultant. But what happened is, I was in my last job. I had a really big job. I was VP of engineering at a big software company. Loved that work, was doing culture change and doing lots of interesting things. But then we had a leadership change. And I got a new boss, and he and I really did not get along in many ways. And there's a longer story there. But essentially, I was forced to leave my job. I'd been in the same company for 20 years. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I also knew I am not done. I think a lot of people thought, well, she's had a long career, she's going to retire. And I felt like this is just the beginning of something because I've learned so much. And I've specifically learned so much about leadership, being in leadership for 20 years, being led by people for 30 plus years. And I felt that we need to do better. And I wanted to take all the learnings that I had accumulated over those decades and help other leaders do better and create better cultures for their employees. And so I decided, well, I'm not going to go work for someone else at this point. I'm going to have to start my own thing. So really in 2020, I started my own business and have since written a couple of books. And that's what I do now. I help leaders be more inclusive.
I love that. And I guess what I want to know is kind of what is the problem that the leaders who kind of, you're working with, what is it that they're trying to solve? Is it within themselves, or is it kind of more outwardly, or is it both?
That's such a that's such a good question because I always feel that we as leaders have to start with ourselves and our own behavior. Now, do leaders come to me and say, I need help with how I'm showing up? Not always, but it could be this. It's often this. We are finding that, we have people who aren't speaking up, and we're hearing, we're getting employee feedback through our surveys or whatever, that it is not an inclusive environment, that it's not psychologically safe. And I don't know what to do about it. So I think, for the most part, leaders that come to me, first of all, they have an appetite to do something. I think that's the first step. They may not know, they have really good intentions and they want to do the right thing, but they're not sure where to start. And where I lead people is to start with, how are you showing up as a leader? And then how can you create the team dynamics where everyone can fully contribute, do their best work, flourish, and thrive? But it does start with the leader themselves.
Yeah. I find that really interesting, and actually I think it would be good to kind of start before kind of going further into inclusive leadership by defining what inclusive leadership is, because I guess that's kind of not a vague term, but is there a better way of kind of describing what it is for our listeners?
I think it is fairly vague because everyone, you can say it and everyone will interpret it in different ways. And so I guess I'll describe how I think about it. And to me, inclusive leadership is when you are an inclusive leader, you create an environment where everyone not only is invited to a seat at the table, but that they have a voice at the table and that their voice is appreciated and respected and heard. Now, it doesn't mean that it is consensual about every decision, right? It's not consensus, but it means that we get to hear from everybody and everyone can have a voice. And that honestly is quite rare because of all the differences in power dynamics and privilege and identity. There are people who do not feel that they can fully contribute. So that's the start of it. But it goes beyond that. And it also means that we as inclusive leaders are aware of our own biases, the biases that are in all of us as human beings, and we actively fight against those biases and try to put systems in place because we are only human. And how can we have more equitable and inclusive systems? And it's not just for hiring, it's for how do we promote people? How do we give people stretch assignments? Who do we think about as our successor and our next leader? Who do we listen to? Who do we ignore? All of these things are what makes leadership inclusive or not. And I think the starting point, the reason I talk a lot about starting with ourselves is that we have to recognize as individuals that we all have this affinity bias. And, that's what it is that we are drawn to the people most like us. And so leaders, if they are not aware of this bias that we all have, it's basically built in our DNA as a species, is that we will hire people just like us. It's why you see leadership teams that all look the same. We will also pay attention to the people we most agree with and most click with. And we may marginalize or ignore or punish the people who disagree or just seem really different from us. So that's the first thing we have to challenge is I'm drawn to people like us, but what I need from my team to be a high performing and inclusive team is to really incorporate the different ways of seeing the world, the different life experiences. And that's where I have to challenge that innate bias that I have and that we all have.
Yeah, no, I find the bias thing really interesting because, we're kind of talking a lot or have spoken a lot in the industry about unconscious bias and trying to remove bias. What's your position on unconscious bias as a kind of a practice?
Well, it's funny, I don't think of it necessarily as a position, but what I'll say is this, is that, one of the first things that so many companies did when they started to say like, oh, we need to do something about DEI is they made every single employee go through unconscious bias training. I did that when I was at my last company. I had to do that. And what the research has shown is that that does not change things in a positive way. And in fact, there's often a negative backlash to doing unconscious bias training, but not doing anything further. Because what do you do then? Like often the message is like, okay, well, we have unconscious bias. So what, right? Now what? And then there's often this negative ramification. So I think what's different is that we need to be aware that the bias is in all of us, but much more importantly is we need to call out and challenge and put systems in place to not let the biases rule how we run our businesses and how we run our teams. So if you only do unconscious bias training, you're not going to get positive results. And I think that's important for organizations to realize. And there's lots of data to back that up. But I do think it's important that we not feel like this is where I think it goes wrong, is that we start to feel beaten up and shamed a bit that we have these biases instead of understanding this is part of our biology. And
Mm.
it doesn't mean you're a bad human being because you have affinity bias or proximity bias or any of these biases that we have. And instead to say, I know I have this. This is part of my biology. And what am I going to do so that does not rule my behavior? And not to just be shamed and embarrassed and feel like I'm a bad human being.
Yeah, no, I completely understand and agree with that. And it's something that I think more people need to hear. And I think I just want to know how the psychological safety piece then plays into this. So, where does psychological safety come into, I suppose, the responsibility of an inclusive leader?
Mm-hmm. Again, a really key question, and one that I've done work on psychological. I co-wrote a book on psychological safety before coming out with my book on inclusive leadership, and I think that order is really natural in a way because what I believe is that psychological safety is the foundation of creating an inclusive culture. And just to make sure we're all on the same page of what we mean when we say psychological safety, it's a team belief that in this team it's a safe place to ask that question or to disagree with someone or to show up as the imperfect human that I am and know that there will not be negative ramifications for doing so. And honestly, this was something I came to while I was in tech before I knew the term psychological safety. I had certainly experienced its presence and how powerful its presence is when you're in a team where there's a high level of psychological safety. Everyone speaks up. We can have debate. It doesn't mean we all agree. In fact, it means we can debate in a really healthy way. And we all know that we have the best interests of the team at heart. And so we want to get to the best solution. And it's very invigorating and fun and energizing and innovative when you're part of that kind of a team. And my experience was that it was rather the exception than the rule. And more often, I was in teams where we hesitated to speak up, where many of us measured every word before we spoke up because we didn't want to be judged or seen as outsiders or troublemakers or all the things that make us different. And that, when I felt that, I even felt that when I was in my highest position. I was a vice president, one of the executives, surrounded by other executives. And yet in those meetings I was a part of, we were very careful. We did not often feel safe. And the leader of that team set the tone because he very clearly signaled who he wanted to listen to and who he didn't. Mm-hmm. And it was really clear who he was rewarding and who he was sort of either ignoring or punishing. And so as I was in those roles and experiencing those things, I then started reading. Like, I was really interested. I found Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety. I found the Google Project Aristotle study that found psychological safety to be the most important thing for a high-performing team. So I, just started to learn a lot more about it. And I realized as I was trying to create an inclusive culture in my own team, even before I started my own business, that unless people felt safe to speak up, we weren't going to get any further. And so that's where I was spending a lot of energy, is how do we do turn taking? How do we hear all the voices? And I just learned a lot about that. And I realized this is so critical. And so often when I think you see it more and more as you read about inclusive leadership and inclusion. People have started to really acknowledge the importance of psychological safety. But when I started doing this work, you didn't see the two correlated very much. And I felt like that was a piece I was putting together for myself as I was doing this work and learning more.
Yeah, as you were telling that story, it just reminded me of, so I went through actor training for my bachelor's degree, and a whole portion of being an actor and going through that training is doing sessions where you kind of have to put yourself out there and get out of your comfort zone. And the funny thing is even for a group of performers, that being the first to say something or being the first one to do so, it really depends on what the workshop was, but to be the first, it was actually it's telling me now that we weren't feeling safe in that environment to just do it and not care about what anyone else was doing in that environment, whether it was singing or moving around the room. So it's just taken me back there. But why is it, do you think, that organizations are starting to kind of talk more about kind of inclusive leadership and psychological safety?
Well, I think so much has changed in recent years. And I think, there have been a number of things that have happened over the last few years. I mean, there was in the US, especially in 2020, there was what I would call the great DEI awakening with George Floyd's murder. And suddenly companies that hadn't been paying attention to culture and diversity, equity, inclusion, their blinders were off and they had to start paying attention to it. And so I think that's where it started for many organizations, not the best circumstances, but also then through the pandemic and seeing, how, first of all, how people were dealing with the fear and being stuck at home and all of this. And how do we still create a culture where people can work together, even if we don't get to be in person? I think organizations started to have to figure out, like, how do we make this work? How do we have connection even when we are physically disconnected? And now I think what's very interesting is that we're in this new world now where, okay, now the employers have more control and they're asking people to come back to work and all of that. So it's quite different. And a lot of employees are pushing back and saying, I don't do my best work in the office, right? This is not, I'm much better off at home. And how do we reconcile this? And how do we really stay connected in this hybrid and messy world? And then finally, I think where we are today with Gen AI and so much fear of our jobs going away, but really, I think the people who get it understand that yes, Gen AI can be a tool for us, but where we need to double down is on our humanity. and
Hmm.
humans bring to the table, whether it's ethical AI or how are we going to interact and still remain relevant. And so I think honestly, I think the organizations that are getting ahead of the game are realizing we need to double down on what is our strength as human beings, and our leaders and managers play the most critical role. They are determining the experience that every employee is having at work, good or bad. And so we need to invest more in our managers and our leaders. And I think these are the companies and organizations that are evolving along with the landscape we're in. And I think the ones that are not are finding like these are cultures people don't want to be a part of. I don't think the term quiet quitting is in anymore, but it's this, this is still around, that people are like, this is not a great environment, but I can't go get another job right now because the market's so tight. So I'm just going to sit back, do the minimum, and
Hmm.
lay low kind of thing. And that's not how you get to high performance or innovation or great retention. When the economy swings the other way and it's an employees market again, then everyone's going to leave and go to the companies that have the cultures where they can do their best work. And right now there's this interesting dichotomy of like, well, the economy, people are getting laid off, but the ones who have their jobs, they may not like where they are because of the culture, but they're staying there and kind of checking out and doing the minimum. So I think the companies and organizations that get it say, we need to invest in our leadership so that the human beings can do the work that human beings are capable of doing in this world of technology now. So I don't know. I think it's complicated because what I see is that there's a real spectrum of how invested organizations are in developing leaders, and some really care and want to
Hmm.
do great work, and some are sort of, there's still the checkbox like, oh, we'll do one workshop and then we'll be done, and that is never enough.
Yeah. Well, it kind of makes me think. So there are two different kind of ways of looking at this. There's from an organizational level and then from the actual leaders themselves about creating that environment of kind of psychological safety. What a word. It's near the end of the day.
Yes, it's
Um and so where where do you think the challenges are in terms of building those inclusive and psychologically safe environments? Is it on an organizational level, or does it come down to the managers themselves?
I think it's a both and answer, honestly. I think it's very hard. I don't think you can say, like, let's say there's a 10,000 person organization, and even if the C level, the executive staff says, I think it's important that the executive staff care about this, and it starts from there. However, what happens in a large organization is that as you certainly work your way down the hierarchy, each leader and individual manager, unless they have been trained, unless they have been supported, unless they have the skills and tools to lead inclusively, they're on their own, right? They may get one or two classes. Often it's the executives who get the coaching, but then you've got your first line manager, and they are having such an impact on someone's work life. And they want to do the right thing, but they don't have the skills and tools and capabilities maybe to be an inclusive leader because they just don't even know what that means. So I believe it has to trickle all the way down, up and down. And one of the things that I often see is that someone will bring me in, and they may not be at the C-suite, but maybe they're a VP. So maybe they're the next level down, and they care deeply about creating a psychologically safe, inclusive environment. And they have control, more or less over their direct reports and their team all the way down the organization. However, they may not be getting support from the executive team. And so what I always say is like, do what you can control, influence what you can influence, and maybe you can influence up. But we know how hard managing up can be. And if that C level doesn't buy into this, you will have success probably within your own domain, but you may not be able to influence up or across the organization if the people who are truly in charge of this organization are not committed to having this inclusive and safe culture. So I think it operates on multiple levels, and it's not a straightforward answer. I do think that when the most senior executives in an organization are committed to their own behavior and really supporting their leaders all the way down the organization, that's when you have transformational cultures.
Yeah. And so what is the kind of the impact of the result if organizations don't kind of buy into this? What's the knock-on effect on their business, do you think?
Well, I think there are a number of effects, and it's often what you see is that, well, because there are many people in the organization who are not contributing to their fullest potential because they're not invited to the table or they're ignored or whatever it is. What's going to happen is you'll probably survive, depending on the organization. You probably will not have thriving employees. You probably will not have highly engaged employees who want to stay with your organization long term. And also what has been shown is that when organizations are not highly inclusive, maybe they have a diverse population, but they're not highly inclusive, the financial performance goes down. I mean, we can see this across the stock market in terms of returns, and also innovation. And so that's if in today's world, most organizations care about innovation because that's how you survive and thrive and grow going forward. Innovation falls off rapidly when you cannot tap into the full talent and ideas in your organization. And what happens, and this is what I saw so much, is that the people who had maybe the most far out there but innovative ideas that we really needed were often the ones who sat back and stayed silent when you were in a meeting or a brainstorming session. And how do we tap into all of those ideas? That's how we get to innovation. And so I think the negative ramifications of not paying attention to creating inclusive cultures is that performance will go down, employee engagement and motivation will go down, and innovation will suffer.
Yeah, absolutely. So it really is in their best interest to really, try and prioritize this. And, it really does come down to, I suppose, the priorities of the organization. But if you're looking at it that way, it's like, well, then, whatever priority you have, this is, a good way of going about it. But for an organizational leader who wants to go about building an inclusive kind of environment and team culture, what is the first step for them? Like, where do they start?
Well, and this is actually one of my chapters in my book, The Boldly Inclusive Leader, is where to start, right? Because that's the question. You get really overwhelmed by this topic, is like, how do I begin? I honestly think that where you begin to be an inclusive leader and to create inclusive cultures is that you personally, as the leader of the group, you start to become one of the best listeners in the world. And you start to get to know the individuals in your team, because you can't. This is one of the things that I certainly learned when I was a first-time manager. You think you just manage everyone the same way, and suddenly you realize, you have a team of 12 people. Every single one of them needs something different. They have different life experiences. They have different communication styles, different cultures, all of that. And the only way you can show up as an inclusive leader is to get to know them and to get to understand, how do you like to communicate? How can you contribute? What's your work style? And so it really starts by having those one-on-one conversations that are not just about the tasks at hand, but how can I support you? What does support look like for you? And getting to know the people as individuals. So that's the starting point. And it seems so simple, but I've seen so many leaders who don't do it, and they just come in and it's like, these are our goals, let's just track everything, and they do not treat their team members as individual human beings. I think that's where we have to start. And of course I can go on from there, but I think that's just the entry point to where we begin.
Yeah, and I suppose as well, there's an acknowledgement to say this isn't going to change overnight. Like, it
That's
is going
right.
to require some kind of continual work. So what kinds of things do you kind of suggest to leaders in terms of maintaining or growing that relationship with their team?
Yes, because I describe it as a journey, because it really is like there's no flipping a switch, first of all, and there's also no done. Right? I
Yeah.
mean, that's one of the things, like, you're never done with this. But I also don't, one of the things that I also want people to understand is it doesn't need to be overwhelming or intimidating and like, oh my God, I'm embarking on something I can't succeed in. These small changes And one of it is like, how do you have your one-on-one conversations? How do you run your team meetings? And how do you make sure that all the voices are heard? How do you prep for them? How do you invite the quiet voices? And maybe they don't want to speak. Maybe they want to write something down. All of these things, they can seem very small and they can seem quite simple, and they can have such a profoundly positive impact. And so what I encourage leaders to do is to start with something, whether it's, how we run our meetings, how do we brainstorm, what do we reward, all of these things that we do as leaders, and then to just little by little make small changes and check in on how they're doing and iterate, because you don't want to try to put in this like huge plan that you'll never finish, and instead just try things and experiment and check in with your team members and get continuous feedback on how are we doing, and I think the pulse surveys that a lot of organizations do are really helpful to see, like, is this helping? Is this hurting? What should I do more of? What should I stop doing? So I think it's just to think of it as more of like, I'm going to experiment with some different behavior, different team norms, different ways of communicating. I would also say that, in the world that we're living in, that's very hybrid, right? I mean, there's some people back in the office, there are people all over the world, people work in different places, is that we often think we have to do everything in a meeting. And meetings often are not very inclusive because they typically reward the loudest voices and the most dominant people. And even if we run them well, I think there's so much more we can do asynchronously that a lot of organizations are not taking advantage of, like shared documentation that we collaborate on, comment on. And then when we come together, we have a purpose for coming together. And I think instead, a lot of what you hear is people are just like, I can't be on another Zoom meeting, or I'm spending my whole day in meetings. Let's rethink how we do work. And so to tap into our potential is when we come together, that this is useful and enjoyable and energizing, as opposed to just sapping my life force, right?
Yeah, no, and what I'm getting is that actually technology can be a huge facilitator of
Yes.
making these interactions inclusive and psychologically safe.
Yes, I'm glad you articulated that, because I that's something I say a lot, is that, a lot of people think that technology is going to diminish inclusion or psychological safety or human connection. But I think if we're smart about it, technology can be a huge aid in boosting these things. And one of the things I like is, shared documentation is one that I really like. But another that I find is amazing to bring out the quiet voices is, we did it in person as an online whiteboard, though, is online whiteboards where you say, let's have 5 minutes of silence while everyone puts down their ideas on sticky notes. So therefore, the loud people are not rewarded. The loud people do not dominate the conversation. And you get all the ideas onto this virtual whiteboard, whether it's Miro or Mural or Jamboard. There's so many of them now, right? They're all available to us. And suddenly there's this amazing idea, and it was from the person you have never heard speak in a meeting. And I learned that, honestly, the hard way, because I was running my meetings one way, and then we were doing more design thinking techniques, which I think are really great for inclusion. And it was the most introverted person in my team, who rarely spoke up in meetings, who had the longest list of post-it notes on the board and some of the most important ideas that wouldn't have come out if we had run things in sort of the old traditional way. So I also think, and we've all seen this if we've been on a Zoom meeting or a Teams meeting, is that there are the people that will unmute themselves, and then there are the people who will only type in the chat. And let's find ways to make sure that chat is useful and that people can use it. Now, I do think that what sometimes happens is that there are two meetings going on. There's the meeting of the people speaking, and there's the meeting of the people having chat. So we have to be mindful of, like, okay, now we're just going to use the chat, or now we're going to do something else, so that we don't have two exclusive meetings going on. But I do think technology can be hugely beneficial, and we should not be afraid of it and think that this dehumanizes it. I think let's use it intelligently.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually it kind of makes me think about, all of these organizations now wanting to bring their workforce back into the workplace, because I suppose for them and for their managers and their leaders, that actually the remote workforce presents a challenge for them, in the sense that they have to start thinking of new ways of engaging, remote workers. But I also think the challenge is that actually for a lot of people, remote work or flexible working, whatever those arrangements are, is actually a huge benefit to them. So what do you have any kind of tips perhaps for leaders who have to manage kind of a hybrid workforce that's, not, and I know that technology is a facilitator of that, but are there any other things that they can be considering?
I think the flexibility is the key, and that we don't want to. I think the organizations that are really not surviving, not it's not that they're not surviving, but that where employees are not happy and thriving are the ones where it said you must be in the office 3 days a week and we're going to check your badge swipes, right? Because there's no rhyme or reason to it, and people feel like I was doing much more effective work at home, and I've now commuted an hour and a half to go into my office to have Zoom meetings. Like, why did I go in? And so to leaders, the advice I would say is like, yes, you're managing a hybrid, complex, messy workforce. So if you are going to ask people to come into the office, and that's fair, there are times when it really makes sense for us to be together in person, and there is nothing like being in the room together. But to make sure that when we come into the office, we're doing this deliberately. We have a purpose for coming together. We're doing the things that are hard to do remotely, and not to demand that people come into the office so they can get into a phone booth and be on Zoom all day, because that will just breed resentment, right? And I know someone who has described that to me. I have a long commute. I go into the office, and most of the time the people I need to meet with are not in the office. So that doesn't make sense. So for leaders, be very clear that our workplace is flexible. We want to support you being able to have the elusive work-life balance, or, even just be able to pick up your kids or care for your elderly parent or go to a doctor's appointment or any of those things. And we're going to have this day where we're all going to come together for this reason, and we're going to be together. We're not going to be on Zoom. And that's what we're going to do together. So I think that's the important thing. Instead of just trying to run business as usual, but then mandating you must be in the office these days without any rhyme or reason for why am I coming in?
Yeah, and also I suppose building trust in the worker themselves and showing that you trust them, because there have been instances of organizations putting spyware or having some kind of
Ugh.
tracking on technology, and that just doesn't it doesn't instill that trust, does it?
How to destroy trust and morale. I mean, I think you have got to, as a leader, even before you have any proof, you have to trust that your employees will do the right thing. And until they prove until you have any evidence to the contrary, you just must trust them. And this micromanaging or anything else is going to backfire. It's not going to get better results. And people, I think the evidence is in that people have worked harder, have done great work working entirely remotely throughout the pandemic, despite all the obstacles of kids not being able to go to school and parents having to multitask, and yet they still did their work. So why do leaders put spyware and feel like they have to monitor? And I think there's also this myth that when people were in the office, we knew what they were doing. I call BS on that. That unless you were always a micromanager checking in and like, what are you doing? You didn't know. You couldn't measure. I mean, it's so rare to be able to measure. And now this thing of like, oh well, if people are working from home, we need to know what they're doing. Nonsense.
Yeah, no,
Honestly.
totally agree. I don't get it. I don't get it. Um, but what advice do you have? If we could kind of sum this discussion up, what would your one piece of advice be to a listener who is an organizational leader who is absolutely, keen to build this inclusive leadership and build a psychologically safe environment for their team?
Well, I would say start where you are. There's no shame no matter where you are, even if you're at the beginning of this journey, start where you are and get really curious to get to know the people as fellow human beings. Treat people with curiosity to get to know them, with kindness and respect, and try to be the leader that brings out the best in everyone around you. And you'll have to find out what the best is for each person and what they need and what support they need from you. And really, you want to be that person who is not only bringing out the best in the people who report to you, but creating the leaders of the future. And so what do they need to become those leaders? And make sure that when you leave and you move on, that there are people who are going to be able to step up to that. And that starts by just being a fellow human being, not having to be perfect, listening with real curiosity, managing how you react when you're challenged, and making sure that everyone truly has a voice that is heard and respected.
Great stuff. Well, thank you so much. And before we finish, I do just want to touch on your book. So, The Boldly Inclusive Leader, who is that aimed at specifically, and what is it that the overall message is of that book?
Well, the message is often very much what we've been talking about today. It is aimed at, honestly, anyone from a first-time manager to a C-level executive, is anyone who manages other human beings and who cares about creating a great culture. And it's broken down. It's got lots of stories because I think that's how people learn. It's stories from my own career, real world. It's all real. None of it is theoretical, although there's definitely research backing everything. But it's the idea that you can pick it up anywhere and find a chapter that's relevant to you. Like, even if it's just, how do you want to run more inclusive meetings? There's a chapter on that. How can I become a better listener? There's a chapter on that. And so it's really meant to be not just theoretical, but a lot of how-to information. There are questions at the back of every chapter for you to work on yourself and with your teammates, so you all can create a better culture together. And I find that when people get this book, people have been getting the book and bringing me in to speak, which I love to do. And I think what they love about it is that there's nothing that I never want to make anyone feel bad about where they are. It's very inviting and it's very practical. And so that's what the book is all about.
Great stuff. And when they're reading that, is there anything that might be surprising to them that either they'll learn or about themselves?
I think, well, one of the surprising things is probably that you're going to have to get uncomfortable to do this work. And I encourage the discomfort, and I describe really uncomfortable situations that I had to work through. So I think there's a little bit of like, I'm inviting you to the discomfort, and it might be surprising. And yet I think that's an important piece. And I guess the other thing is that it doesn't really matter where you are or what industry you're in. And that's what was surprising. I'll tell you what was surprising to me when I wrote this book. And of course, when you write a book, you have to define your target audience. And I sort of thought it was going to be corporate leaders, specifically in tech, because that's my background. What I have been finding is that even the people that have been inviting me in to do consulting and speaking are not just in the tech industry. I've been doing work in government, both federal and state and local government. I've been working with a university. I'm working with a school district. So what I'm finding is that, and I shouldn't be surprised by this, but is that the lessons in the book and the messages in the book are for anyone who leads teams of people in any industry. And I don't think I realized quite how universal this was. So that was my big surprise as an author.
Yeah, I get that as well, because this conversation that we've had is yes, kind of almost broad sweeping in terms of we've not spoken about industry, but actually I think that's because there is really this transferable knowledge into all of these industries that could really benefit from this kind of discussion and the insights that you'll provide in the book as well. So, Minette, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me about inclusive leadership and psychological safety. I hope our listeners have learned just as much as I have. So thank you so much. Any links that you provide us will be added to the podcast description. I really can't speak now. It's getting to the end of the day. I'm sorry. But once again, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
I've enjoyed the conversation, Erica. Thanks for inviting me.